Have you ever noticed that the person everyone underestimates is often the one who ends up winning? Not the loudest voice in the room, not the most credentialed, not the one with the most followers, the most connections, the most visible power. The one who says little, who observes everything, who seems ordinary until the moment they're not, and by then it's already too late for everyone who dismissed them. There is a form of intelligence that doesn't show up on any test, that no institution teaches, that no mentor openly passes down, because those who possess it understand instinctively that its value depends on not being widely understood. It operates in the space between what people say and what they mean. It reads rooms the way a strategist reads a battlefield. It doesn't react. It observes, calculates, and then moves with a precision that appears effortless only because all the work happened invisibly. This is what we call shadow intelligence. And once you understand how it actually works, you will never see social dynamics, power, or human behavior the same way again. Machiavelli didn't admire intellect for its brilliance. He admired it for its capacity to dominate without being detected. The men he studied who shaped empires, who outlasted enemies far more powerful than themselves, were not uniformly the most gifted or the most talented. They were the most perceptive. They read people with a clinical accuracy that others experienced as intuition, but was actually a trained and deliberate practice of observation, pattern recognition, and strategic positioning. This video is not about becoming cold, manipulative, or cruel. It is about something far more valuable, becoming unreadable, unmanipulable, and unmovable. It is about developing the kind of mind that perceives what others miss, responds to what others react to, and builds quietly while the world is distracted by its own noise. By the end of this, you will understand the architecture of shadow, intelligence, how it is built, how it operates, and how to begin installing it into the way you move through the world. And you will understand why the people who have it are the ones everyone else ends up fearing, even when they can't explain why. Part 1. The world rewards the wrong thing. Let's start with an honest observation about the world you were raised in. You were taught that intelligence looks a certain way, that it announces itself, that the smart person is the one who raises their hand first, speaks most clearly, impresses the room, demonstrates their knowledge openly. You were rewarded for displaying understanding, for performing competence, for making your intelligence visible to the people evaluating you. This trained you to do exactly the wrong thing, because the world outside the classroom, outside the performance culture of education and social media and corporate approval seeking, does not work by those rules. In the actual arena of human dynamics, in business, in relationships, in the invisible hierarchies that structure every room you enter, visible intelligence without strategic control is a liability. It tells people what you know. It shows them how you think. It reveals your patterns, your models, your conclusions, before you've had any opportunity to understand theirs. The man who explains his strategy impresses some people and warns his opponents simultaneously. The man who keeps his strategy hidden moves first only when the advantage is clear and irreversible. These are not equally effective approaches. One of them consistently produces outcomes. The other consistently produces admiration without leverage. Watch what happens in any group setting where a high-stakes decision is being made. The people who speak first, who lay out their reasoning most comprehensively, who invest themselves most visibly in a position, are also the people who are most constrained. They have staked their credibility on a conclusion. They cannot easily adapt, cannot shift without appearing inconsistent, cannot incorporate new information without appearing to have been wrong. They are locked. The person who observes that process from a slight distance, who listens more than speaks, who asks one or two questions that seem simple but are actually designed to surface hidden assumptions, that person ends the meeting knowing far more than they revealed and with far greater flexibility of movement. They haven't committed to a position. They've gathered data, and when they do speak, it is with an accuracy and a weight that surprises people who assumed their quietness was emptiness. This is not a natural trait. It is a trained orientation, and understanding why most people operate in the opposite mode is the first step toward building out of it. Part 2. The foundation. Observation without reaction. The bedrock of shadow intelligence is a skill that sounds deceptively simple and is actually extraordinarily difficult to develop. The ability to observe without reacting. Not observation in the casual sense of noticing things. Systematic, deliberate observation of what people actually reveal when they believe they are not being closely watched. The gap between what they say and what they do. The moment of hesitation before an answer that seems confident. The eyes that check the room before a claim is made. The laughter that arrives a half-second too late. The topic that produces a fractional but perceptible shift in posture. Most people read these signals unconsciously and file them as vague impressions. They feel something is off without being able to articulate why. Shadow intelligence is the practice of making that process explicit, of training your perception to register those signals consciously, to name them, to catalog them, and to use them as data. Machiavelli built his understanding of human nature not from abstract theorizing, but from years of watching powerful people perform their power, negotiate their interests, reveal their fears through the very strategies they used to conceal them. He understood that people in positions of authority are typically more exposed than people with nothing to protect, because they are managing more interests simultaneously, and the weight of that management produces readable pressure. This observation principle applies universally. The person in the meeting who protests most loudly that a proposal is wrong is frequently the person who fears most directly that it might succeed and shift the power balance. The colleague who volunteers the most detailed explanation for why they weren't responsible for a failure is almost always involved in it. The friend who questions most aggressively why you're pursuing a new direction is processing their own feelings about stagnation, not offering you objective analysis. None of these people are lying exactly. They are doing what all people do, speaking from their emotional and strategic position while believing they are. Speaking objectively. Shadow intelligence is the capacity to hear both signals simultaneously. What they're saying and what the fact of their saying it in that way reveals about where they actually are. How do you build this? Begin with one practice, deployed consistently over time. After every significant conversation, write down two things: what was said and what you noticed that wasn't said, the physical signals, the emotional weather, the topics that landed with unusual weight or were conspicuously avoided, the moments of over-explanation or under-explanation. You are training your observation to become explicit rather than impressionistic. Over time, this produces a qualitative shift in how you perceive interactions, a kind of depth resolution that wasn't available before. Part 3. The 5 signals of hidden truth. Once you begin observing systematically, certain categories of signal become visible that most people spend their entire lives missing. Let me walk you through the 5 most consistent and most powerful. The first is the over-explanation. When someone provides far more justification than the situation requires, they are almost always doing it for themselves rather than for you. Genuine confidence does not justify itself. The man who is secure in a decision makes it and moves forward. The man who has doubts, who feels exposed, who is managing internal conflict about a choice, produces elaborate rationales, not because you asked for them, but because his own uncertainty is pulling the words out of him. When you hear excessive justification, you are hearing anxiety speaking. The question is, what is the anxiety about? The second is the misdirected aggression. Anger, in its most honest form, attaches itself to its actual source. But anger that arrives at the wrong target that seems disproportionate to the situation, that attaches to someone or something peripheral, is almost always displaced from its real origin. The person who erupts over a minor procedural issue in a meeting is not angry about the procedure. The person who attacks you sharply over a small thing is processing something larger. The signal tells you not what they're angry about, but where their unresolved pressure is located, which gives you information about what they cannot afford to look at directly. The third is the unsolicited reassurance. When someone goes out of their way to tell you they're fine, that things are good, that a situation is completely under control when you didn't ask, they're addressing an assumption they believe you have or wish you had about them. The content of the reassurance reveals the fear. If someone tells you unprompted that they're not worried about money, worry about money is present. If someone tells you unprompted that they don't care what a particular person thinks, that person's opinion occupies significant space. Listen for what people deny when no one has made the accusation. The denial is the confession. The fourth is the precision of selective memory. People remember clearly what matters to them and forget what doesn't. In any account of events, the details someone recalls with precision and the details they claim not to remember are both data. What they remember precisely is what was important to them in a way they may not have acknowledged. What they don't remember is frequently what would complicate a narrative they are managing. Neither selective accuracy nor selective forgetting is conscious manipulation in most cases. It is just how memory serves the emotional needs of the person using it. Reading this pattern consistently tells you what people actually care about beneath their stated positions. The fifth is the calibrated vulnerability. There is genuine vulnerability and there is performed vulnerability, and learning to distinguish between them is one of the most valuable perceptual skills available. Genuine vulnerability has a quality of rawness, of exposure that wasn't planned, of a person surprised by their own openness. Performed vulnerability, the kind deployed strategically to create intimacy, lower your defenses, or generate a sense of reciprocal obligation, has a different quality. It is slightly too shaped. It arrives at slightly too convenient a moment. It produces intimacy at a rate that is too fast, too clean, too perfectly calibrated to your apparent receptivity. When you feel yourself rapidly trusting someone who has opened up to you with unusual speed, pause. Ask what the disclosure actually cost them, what they revealed that put them at genuine risk. Authentic vulnerability leaves the person exposed. Performed vulnerability is designed to expose you. Part 4. The art of being unreadable. Observation without projection, perception without reaction. These are the receiving skills of shadow intelligence. But shadow intelligence is not only about what you take in, it is equally about what you give nothing away. Becoming unreadable is not about becoming cold or socially strange. It is about developing a controlled gap between what you experience internally and what you express externally. Not because what you feel is wrong or should be suppressed, but because your emotional architecture, visible to others, is their primary tool for predicting and therefore managing your behavior. Consider what happens when someone knows exactly what makes you angry. They have the ability to produce your anger on demand, and a person in anger is not performing at their highest level of judgment or strategy. They are reactive, partial, blind to their own bias, and committed to positions they might otherwise examine. The person who reliably produces your anger owns your behavior in that state more than you do. Now consider what happens when someone knows exactly what makes you feel valued, appreciated, seen. They have the ability to produce your goodwill on demand. And goodwill, while not in itself problematic, creates vulnerability. A person who feels genuinely appreciated by someone is more likely to make concessions they wouldn't otherwise make, to overlook things they would otherwise notice, to interpret ambiguous signals generously rather than accurately. Both of these emotional systems, the anger trigger and the approval trigger, are points of access into your decision-making. Shadow intelligence requires reducing both, not eliminating the capacity to feel anger or appreciation, but removing those feelings from the predictable, externally visible architecture that makes them exploitable. The practical work of this is deceptively specific. It begins with identifying your most reliable emotional triggers, not in theory, but through honest self-observation. What specific types of situations, words, or behaviors reliably pull a strong reaction from you? What specific forms of recognition or appreciation reliably soften your judgment? These are the access points. The work is to develop enough internal distance from these responses that they no longer produce automatic external signals, that when someone says the thing that would normally produce visible irritation, you can receive it, register it, and respond from a position of your own choosing, rather than from reflex. This is not built in a day. It is built through exactly the practice Machiavelli embodied, observing your own reactions as an external analyst would observe them, with a kind of scientific detachment that allows you to see them clearly, enough to choose when and how to respond to them, rather than simply being driven by them. Part 5. The language architecture of shadow intelligence. Words are weapons when used precisely, and liabilities when used carelessly. Shadow intelligence has a specific relationship with language that differs fundamentally from how most people speak. Most people talk to express, to communicate their thoughts and feelings in the moment, to connect, to explain, to argue, to justify. Their words are alive, feed of their interior state, which means anyone listening has access to that state and everything it reveals about their positions, their certainties, their doubts, their desires. The person operating from shadow intelligence talks to achieve specific outcomes. Each word choice is a decision, not an expression. The goal of any given statement is not to share what is thought, but to produce a specific effect in the mind of the listener. This is not dishonesty, it is precision. The difference between a surgeon making a specific incision and a person who simply cuts. What does this look like in practice? The first principle is that silence is a complete statement. When you have nothing to say that advances your position, saying nothing is the correct choice. Most people cannot hold silence in social contexts. It feels like failure, like inadequacy, like a social obligation not being met. The person who can hold silence comfortably communicates without saying a word that they are not defined by the social pressure to fill space. This is perceived by others as confidence, even as authority, even when the silence has nothing in it but the decision to wait. The second principle is that questions are more powerful than statements. A statement commits you to a position. A well-chosen question extracts information, reveals the questioner's intelligence without disclosing their conclusion, and places the other person in the position of having to reveal their reasoning first. The Socratic method was not just a philosophical technique, it was a power move. Machiavelli would have recognized it immediately. The person who asks the right question at the right moment controls the direction of any conversation without having declared a position that can be challenged. The third principle is the strategic incomplete disclosure, revealing just enough to sustain interest without revealing enough to be fully understood. This is not deception. It is the natural expression of a mind that has learned to be selective. Full disclosure makes you completely readable. Selective disclosure creates a carefully managed degree of mystery, and mystery is, as every strategist understands, a form of advantage. What people don't know about you cannot be used to predict, constrain, or undermine you. The fourth principle is the delayed response. The instinct in conversation is to respond quickly, to demonstrate that you have understood, to keep the energy of exchange moving. But the person who consistently takes a half second or a full second longer than expected before responding, communicates something important, that they think before they speak. Over time, this creates an expectation in others that your words carry weight. Not because you have told them that, but because your consistent rhythm of thoughtfulness before speaking trains their perception to treat your words as considered rather than reflexive. Part 6. Operating in the arena of relationships. All of this theory reaches its most consequential application in relationships, the arena where most people are most exposed, most vulnerable, and most reliably operated against without realizing it. Relationships, whether professional, social, or intimate, are structures of mutual knowledge. The depth of a relationship is typically measured by how much each party knows about the other. But this framing, while intuitive, is also dangerous if accepted without examination, because knowledge is leverage, and asymmetric knowledge, where one person knows significantly more about the other than the other knows about them, is asymmetric leverage. This doesn't mean relationships should be cold or strategic in the crude sense. It means that shadow intelligence applies a certain precision to the question of what to reveal, to whom, and when. Not all people deserve access to the same information about you. Not all relationships have demonstrated the reciprocity and reliability that would make vulnerability safe. The instinct to share, to connect, to be known is real and valuable. The skill is calibrating the depth of disclosure to the demonstrated trustworthiness of the recipient. The person who shares everything quickly, who opens up to relative strangers, who needs to be fully known immediately, is operating from need rather than choice. A need in a relationship is the engine of manipulation. The person who shares with precision, who gives access to deeper layers of themselves gradually, in proportion to what the relationship has demonstrated it can hold, is building a structure that serves genuine connection while protecting against exploitation. Machiavelli's observation of courts and alliances was clear on this. The men who were most useful to powerful people were those who were difficult to fully understand. They could not be taken for granted because they could not be completely predicted. They could not be simply discarded because the cost of their opposition was unclear. They maintained a productive uncertainty in the minds of those they worked with, which translated to a consistent leverage that more openly readable people simply didn't have. This doesn't require deliberate deception. It requires the discipline of not oversharing, not over-explaining, not constantly updating others on your interior state. It requires the understanding that mystery is not distance. It is a form of respect for the value of your own depth. Part 7. The shadow move. Acting after others have revealed. Here is where shadow intelligence produces its most concrete practical advantage. It is not in observation alone, or in being unreadable, or in precise language. It is in the combination of all of these, deployed in the specific context of waiting for others to fully reveal themselves before you move. Most people act early. They commit to positions before the situation is fully clear. They signal their intentions before the outcome is determined. They respond to provocations in real time rather than in chosen time. They play their strongest cards early in negotiations because they are afraid the opportunity will close before they use them. The shadow intelligence practitioner does the opposite. They wait, not out of passivity or fear, but out of the understanding that information is the primary strategic resource in any human dynamic, and that time produces information while premature action consumes it. In any negotiation, the person who speaks first has revealed their flaw or ceiling. In any conflict, the person who escalates first has shown the depth of their investment. In any social hierarchy, the person who needs to establish dominance most visibly is the person who feels it most uncertain. Shadow intelligence reads all of this as data and then acts from a position of superior information. knowing the other party's constraints and priorities better than they know yours. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the fox. Not deception for its own sake, but the intelligent use of information asymmetry to move at the right time, in the right direction, with the right precision. The lion announces itself. The fox chooses when to be known. In practical terms, this means when someone challenges you before responding, observe. Let the challenge sit for a moment. What are they actually asking for? What does the form of the challenge reveal about where they feel insecure? What is the real negotiation? Underneath the surface of the confrontation, you will almost always find that the explicit confrontation is not the actual issue. The actual issue is something the other person is unable to say directly. And addressing the actual issue, rather than the surface one, produces outcomes that addressing the surface issue never could. Part 8. The construction of the shadow mind. Let's consolidate this into something actionable, because none of it is useful as theory without a practice, and shadow intelligence is not an attitude or an identity one adopts. It is a set of capacities built through specific, repeated disciplines applied over time. The first discipline is daily observation practice. Pick one interaction each day and analyze it afterward with complete honesty. Not what happened, but what was happening beneath what happened. What did each person's behavior reveal about what they actually needed, feared, or wanted? What signals were present that you either noticed in the moment or wish you had noticed? What would you have done differently with full awareness of the subtext? This practice, sustained for months, produces a qualitative shift in how you perceive human behavior. Your pattern recognition becomes faster, more accurate, more comprehensive. The second discipline is controlled response practice. In lower stakes situations, deliberately introduce a pause before every response. Not to seem thoughtful, but to actually be thoughtful. To choose your response rather. Then produce it reflexively. Over time, this pause becomes natural, unconscious, and your responses become consistently more precise and more strategically chosen than they would be under the pressure of instant reaction. The third discipline is selective disclosure. Over the next week, notice every moment when you share information about yourself that wasn't directly requested. Not in forced silence, but in genuine evaluation. Is this serving a real purpose, or is it anxiety-driven? Transparency. Each piece of information you share about yourself, your plans, your reactions, your history, is a data point others can use to construct a model of you. Building the habit of intentionality around what you share, of choosing disclosure rather than defaulting to it, gradually creates a more strategically managed version of how you are known. The fourth discipline is pattern cataloging. Begin keeping a private record of the behavioral patterns you observe in the people you interact with regularly. Not judgmentally, but analytically. What are their reliable emotional triggers? What topics produce over-explanation or avoidance? What forms of interaction seem to produce their best thinking, and what forms produce defensive reaction? This is not a tool for manipulation. It is a tool for navigation, for understanding how to engage with people in ways that are actually productive rather than in ways that consistently hit their defensive perimeters. The fifth discipline is the retrospective analysis of misjudgments. Every time you are surprised by someone's behavior, every time reality contradicted your expectation of a person or situation, treat it as data rather than grievance. What were the signals you missed or dismissed? What assumptions were you making that the outcome is now invalidated? Where were you reading the situation through the filter of what you wanted to be true, rather than what the available evidence suggested was true? This retrospective practice is the fastest way to calibrate your perception against reality, rather than against your own preferred narrative. Part 9. What shadow intelligence is not. Because this can be misunderstood, Let me be precise about the distinctions. Shadow intelligence is not cynicism. The cynic has decided in advance that people are unreliable, selfish, and fundamentally untrustworthy, and uses that assumption to interpret everything they observe. This is not perception, it is a filter. It produces distorted readings because it has a predetermined conclusion. Shadow intelligence has no predetermined conclusion. It observes accurately, which means it is capable of recognizing genuine reliability, genuine trustworthiness, genuine goodwill when those are present. It simply doesn't assume their presence in advance. Shadow intelligence is not manipulation. Manipulation is the use of deception or psychological pressure to produce outcomes against the interests of the manipulated party. Shadow intelligence is the strategic management of your own transparency combined with accurate reading of others, neither of which requires deception. You can be completely honest in everything you say and still practice shadow intelligence, because shadow intelligence is not about what you say, but about what you observe and what you choose to reveal about yourself. Shadow intelligence is not coldness. The person who has developed genuine shadow intelligence is typically more present in interactions, not less, because they are actually paying attention rather than performing attention. They are more curious about people, not less, because curiosity is the engine of accurate observation. They are more genuinely connected in relationships where connection is warranted, because they have the perceptual precision to recognize when it is. What shadow intelligence does produce is immunity. Immunity to manipulation, because you can see it coming. Immunity to social pressure, because you understand its mechanism. Immunity to the need for external validation, because you have developed an internal reference point that doesn't require the world's confirmation. And immunity is not the same as distance. It is freedom. The freedom to choose your responses rather than have them chosen for you. The freedom to engage fully and authentically without being controlled by the engagement. Part 10. The person they cannot touch. There is a final quality that shadow intelligence produces, and it is the one that others experience most viscerally, even when they cannot name it. It is the quality of being genuinely untouchable, not because you are defended or armored or emotionally closed, but because your sense of your own value doesn't live in the world's assessment of you. Most people's self-perception is largely assembled from external feedback. They feel good about themselves when they are praised, approved of, desired, valued. They feel uncertain about themselves when they are criticized, dismissed, rejected, ignored. This externally assembled identity is not stable because the external world is not stable, and because it is not stable, it is perpetually at the mercy of whoever controls the feedback. The person with shadow intelligence has, through years of rigorous self-observation and the deliberate removal of their sense of worth from external validation, built something internally that doesn't move when the world moves. Not a performance of confidence, not an affirmation, an actual structure of self-knowledge so thorough that the world's opinion, positive or negative, is received as data rather than as verdict. This is what Machiavelli ultimately described when he wrote about the prince who remained stable across fortune and misfortune, not the prince who was never affected by circumstances, the prince who was not governed by circumstances, who received what the world delivered, triumph and reversal both, with the same steady analytical presence, because his sense of his own capacity and his own judgment was not contingent on the world confirming them. This is what others feel as power. They can't manipulate the person who doesn't need their approval. They can't destabilize the person whose stability doesn't come from their reaction. They can't reduce the person who doesn't measure their worth in the currency of others' opinions. And facing someone like that is genuinely disorienting to those who have only learned to navigate the world by leveraging other people's needs. They don't fear you because you are aggressive, or because you are threatening, or because you have more resources. They fear you because you are unreadable, because you don't react the way they expected, because the tactics that work on everyone else don't seem to work on you, because you move through the world as if you already know something they don't, and you're choosing not to show what it is. That is shadow intelligence, not a technique, an architecture, built over time, through attention, through discipline, through the unglamorous daily practice of observing clearly, thinking before acting, and choosing what to reveal rather than defaulting to transparency. The world doesn't teach this because the world benefits from you being readable, reactive, and dependent on its validation. Institutions produce people who perform their intelligence openly. Social culture produces people who express everything they feel. The attention economy produces people who need constant external confirmation of their own existence. Shadow intelligence is the deliberate reversal of all of that. It is the choice to develop a mind that the world cannot fully access, cannot reliably predict, and therefore cannot reliably control. Once you begin building this, you will look around and see everything differently, not with contempt for those who haven't, but with a kind of quiet clarity about what is actually happening in every room you enter. You will see the performances for what they are. You will hear the real conversations underneath the stated ones. You will move through social dynamics with a navigation that others experience as instinct, but is actually precision. And you will understand why the men the world remembers were so often not the loudest, or the most obvious, or the most demonstrably powerful. They were the ones who saw more than they showed, who understood more than they said, who waited longer than everyone else before moving, and then moved once, definitively, from a position of such complete information that the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. That is who you are building. Not in a single conversation, or a single decision, or a single moment of discipline. In the accumulation of all of it, every day, every interaction, every choice to observe rather than react, to listen rather than speak, to see clearly rather than comfortably. The shadow architect doesn't build loudly, they build precisely. And what they build lasts. Write in the comments, I see clearly and move precisely. Not for the algorithm. As a marker for yourself of the moment, you understood that the most dangerous intelligence in any room is the kind that no one sees coming until it has already arrived. The architecture begins now.